This is why I'm traumatized from sleeping in the dark. One night I was watching a movie, then I started to hear something at my window, but I assumed it was bushes or something. But then my dog started jumping and acting crazy, so I paused the movie and I slowly walked towards my window. When I peeked through the window, I believe I saw a pair of eyes, so I jumped back really fast, but then I looked again and it was gone. I was watching a scary movie, so I didn't want to overthink that I actually just saw a pair of eyes. I was home alone, so I tried to stay calm. Even though my dog was going crazy, I brushed it off and continued to watch my movie. I started to doze off until I heard the same noise, but not on the outside. This time it was coming from my room. I was so scared to get up and turn on my light, so I turned on my flashlight, and as soon as I turned on my flashlight, I saw the same pair of eyes staring and smiling at me at the edge of my bed.
If you've heard of the movie Megan is Missing, you're gonna want to hear this story. So this movie is based off a real story of a man named Ward Weaver. So Ward Weaver grew up in Portland, Oregon, and he turned out to be The movie Megan is Missing is based on the time that two girls and them and some met in his backyard. My parents lived in Oregon their whole life until they had kids, and they were always buying houses and flipping them. So they were constantly looking for new houses to buy. So my parents found this one house in northern Portland that they thought was a pretty nice house and it was pretty cheap. So they decided to go check it out. So after the realtor showed my parents this house, they decided to buy it. After the first few days of them trying to flip this house, they noticed some really weird things starting to happen. There were lights that were randomly flashing and doors that would randomly close. Then they hear a knock on the door. I'm sorry, but come back for part 2. Here's part 2 to the Megan is Missing story time. So we left off where a lady was knocking on the door. This lady turned out to be a neighbor, and she said she heard someone bought the property. She said she had a really eerie feeling about the house and was convinced it was haunted. So she was pretty spiritual and came over and saged the whole house. This lady also mentioned that she needed to get holy water to bless the house from a priest, but she stated that she couldn't get rid of it. Now, my parents understood why she thought the house might be haunted, but then this happened. My dad and his friend were staying the night at the house because they had a lot of work to get done. In the middle of the night, my dad heard something downstairs. And keep in mind, the downstairs is where pretty much all of the haunted stuff that was happening was taking place. So my dad, when he went downstairs, sees his friend standing against a wall talking to it. Now, when they both woke up in the morning, his friend said he had no idea that was happening. Also, I forgot to mention in part 1 that my dad would find bones all over the backyard. He thinks they were dog. Part 3 to the Megan is Missing story time. This is the last part, and for everyone wondering, yes, it's a true story. So we left off where my dad was finding bones in the backyard. He said that he thinks they could be dog bones but isn't sure. Also, in the basement, my dad said he found this fake bed. It was made out of wood and in a really weird hallway where you just wouldn't expect a bed to be. Every time my dad tells this story, he always talks about this bed, so I think there was something really, really off about it. So my family was having a really hard time selling this house, and they were really confused why. Then, when they were talking to the neighbor about it, the one that saged the house, so she said that Ward Weaver grew up there, and him and his father were... So my parents think that there was some that happened in the house, and that's why it's so haunted.
I'm going to be telling you the scary story of the house I lived in elementary and middle school. It was a 3-bedroom house, 1 bedroom in the basement, and 2 bedrooms upstairs. Because I was the oldest, I got put in the bedroom in the basement. Right when we moved in, I already had creepy feelings about the house. I hated being downstairs by myself. One day I dropped a $20 bill behind my dresser. I decided to move my dresser all by myself, and behind the dresser was this door. It wasn't a normal door, it was really short and just squared. It was also glued off, so I couldn't get into it. Me and my neighbor, who were best friends, worked at it for days to get into it. We finally got it open, and inside was another room. It was almost like an underground attic. The walls were wooden, the ceiling was wooden. There was no carpet, but it smelled awful. My parents found out, and they were super mad at me for opening the room. They of course put that dresser in front of that door for a reason, because they knew I would explore it. But after that, things started to get weird. Stay tuned for part 2. This is part 2 of my scary childhood story about the door behind my dresser. Of course, my parents were really mad at us for opening it up, so they sealed it back up. They just didn't want us to get hurt from all the rusty nails or if there was mold inside. But I think we released something when we opened that door and a lot of things started to happen. First, I started having night terrors to the point where I would scream at the top of my lungs and not wake up. My parents would have to come downstairs and wake me up and put me back to bed. Then, every single night, I would have this reoccurring dream that me, my mom, and my brother were all at a picnic at the beach. This super old lady would walk up to us and she would take me. She then would lock me up in the room behind my dresser. This dream would reoccur every single night for months. It scared me so much that I started to not sleep at night. I developed insomnia and would only sleep for 2 to 3 hours per night at only 8 years old. There was a couple nights where I swear I saw the old lady standing in the corner of my room. My parents just thought I was hallucinating from no sleep though. Stay tuned for part 3. This is part 3 of my scary childhood story about the door behind my dresser. Because I wasn't sleeping and developed insomnia, my parents took me to a sleep therapist. The only thing the therapist gave me was a bunch of sleeping pills. Even though the sleeping pills worked, it made my dreams so much worse. I even started walking in my sleep. I would wake up all the time not in my bed. My covers would be all the way across the room like someone had dragged them over there. One night, one of my best friends slept over and we heard knocking coming from the door behind my dresser. That night when we went to bed, she started speaking really creepy gibberish in her sleep. I had to go get my mom to wake her up. I woke up a couple nights feeling like I was suffocating, and when I swung out of bed, I saw a silhouette of an old lady. My cat even started to sit there and meow and hiss at random things in the corners of the room. But there was nothing ever there. It got so bad to the point where I moved up into my brother's room. If any of you have listened to all 3 parts and are experts on spirits, please message me on Instagram and tell me what you think I released that night when I opened the door.
This is why you should always lock your doors. A junior in high school was home alone working on a paper while his parents were out to dinner. All night he sits with his back to his door, sitting at his desk with his noise-canceling headphones on. Around 11 o'clock he takes his headphones off at the same time his parents are returning to the house, and he hears his mom from downstairs yell, "Hey Adrian, what happened?" Confused, he runs downstairs and sees right away what she's looking at, muddy footprints all over the rug. He tells her, "I didn't leave my desk." And then they realize someone must have broken in. They look at the footprints and there's none leaving the house. They're worried someone's still in the house, so they run into the garage, terrified, call the police. Police arrive and they don't find anyone in the house, but they do make a chilling discovery upstairs. The police bring them to the kid's bedroom door, which had been left open all night, and they point to the message written on it in Sharpie. This is the actual transcript of what was written on his door, which means for nearly 2 hours, someone stood in this kid's doorway watching him.
This is why you should never knock on a stranger's door. Once there was a man trying to check into a hotel. The woman at the front desk gave him his key and told him none of the guests are allowed to go into the room across the hall. He agreed, but as he continued to stay in the hotel, he grew more and more curious about the room he wasn't supposed to go in. At one point, he even walked down the hall to that room and tried the door. It was locked. Then he bent down and looked through the keyhole. He saw that it was just the same as his hotel room. But in the corner of the room, there was a woman whose skin was extremely pale, almost a sickly white. Her back was to the wall, so the man didn't see what she looked like. He almost knocked on the door, but then just decided to leave her alone. The next day, he walked past the door again and decided to look into the keyhole. This time, there was no hotel room and no woman. It was all just red. He thought that this seemed really strange, so he went to the front desk and asked about the room. After insisting on an answer, the woman at the front desk told him, "A long time ago, a man killed his wife in that room, and her ghost is still there. But these ghosts are not what you might imagine. They're completely white all over, except for their eyes, which are red."
This is why you should never stay in sketchy motels. In 2005, a young woman on a solo road trip across the country decided to stop for the night. The first place she sees is the Mountaintop Motel. It looked pretty cheap, but she was tired, so she said good enough. The check-in guy eyed her up and down very uncomfortably and then asked her if she was traveling alone. She ignores the question, pays for her room, and then walks away with the key. When she gets inside her room and sees there are literally cockroaches in her bed, she says nope and decides to sleep in her car in the parking lot. Around 3 a.m., she wakes up to see the check-in guy using his own keys to get into the motel room she was supposed to be in. A few minutes later, he storms out and slams the door and starts walking towards her car. Terrified, she hides under her blanket as the man tries to open her car doors but can't and walks away. She speeds off and calls her friend and asks her to look up the address of Mountaintop Motel so she can give it to police. Her friend's quiet for a second and then just says, "The Mountaintop Motel closed a week ago."
I am going to be telling you a scary childhood story. When I was 2 years old, my mom passed away. My dad wasn't in the picture, so I went to go live with my grandparents. My grandparents lived in a super old home that was built in the 1800s. I was a very imaginative child. So when I told my grandparents that I used to see people in the house, they just didn't believe me. There was one lady in particular that I would always see. She would sit at the end of my bed and watch me fall asleep. I wasn't scared of her because I thought she was an actual person. Plus, I was super little, so nothing even crossed my mind. At this point, I was like 4 or 5 years old. I remember her talking to me constantly. She even sang me the song Rockabye Baby to get me to go to bed one night. Every single day when I would get home, I could see her in my window. At that point, I thought she was just waiting for me. She just wanted to be my friend, right? But as I got older, things started to get really weird between me and her. She wasn't this nice lady anymore. Stay tuned for part 2. This is part 2 of the lady in my room who would sing me lullabies to get me to go to bed. No one else in my family could see her. She even told me that she was my mom. I really believed her. If you remember, my mom passed away when I was 2. So, it seemed pretty real that it was my mom. I didn't really remember what my mom's face looked like when she passed away. And this lady, could be my mom. She continued to sing me lullabies every single night when I would go to bed. She would always be waiting for me in the window when I would get home from school. But I figured out pretty quickly it wasn't my mom. My mom was a sweet, kind-hearted person. This spirit was evil. She would get mad at me every single time any of my friends would come over. She told me she could see my future and that I was going to go to hell after I died in a car accident. It scared me so much, but no one believed me. It got to the point where I never even wanted to go in the car because I thought I was going to die. She convinced me I was evil. Stay tuned for part 3.
This is why you should never play hide and seek. A mom decided to play hide and seek with her 2 kids. The mom began counting, ready or not, here I come. She begins searching the downstairs kitchen because she knows that they hide there every single time. As she's walking to the kitchen, she starts saying, I wonder where they are. She looks under the table and sees they aren't there, which is kind of odd. She knew they were too scared to go into the basement alone, but she decided to check anyway. They weren't there either. She began to panic. The mom then says, Jordan, Casey, come out now, mommy's not playing anymore. There was no answer. Panic really begins to set in. She decides to call 911 and reaches an operator. She tells the operator what's wrong and the operator sends an officer to her house. Once the officer arrives, he says, don't worry, we will find them. As she's sitting in the living room, she hears giggling and laughing and hears a closet door slam upstairs. She sprints upstairs and says, Jordan, Casey, you worried me sick. She opened the closet door and nobody was there. While all of this is going on, she hears the doorbell ring. She runs downstairs and finds the officer holding Jordan and Casey. The officer says they were hiding in the shed out back. Then Jordan looks at mommy and says, why were you telling us to stay in the shed?
I was about 15 years old when this happened. It was 4 in the morning and I knew that I had to wake up for school in about 2 hours. So I was questioning why I was even awake before my alarm. This is something that never happened. But I've always had kind of like a sixth sense where I can sense things that no one else normally senses. My room was dark, but I looked over at my mirror that was across from my bed and I saw the Grim Reaper standing there in all of his glory. He looked exactly how you would imagine it in a cartoon, with that huge long fork of a knife or whatever it's called, a huge cloak that covered his face. I really genuinely could not see his face even though I tried to fix my eyes on it. But as I was realizing what I was looking at, because I had not really processed what was going on, I felt as if I was being tied to my bed. I couldn't move. I was paralyzed. Come back for part 2. Wide awake and completely aware of everything that was going on. I could not move. I was fixated on him. My body could not move. I tried to scream, but nothing came out of my throat. And in that split second when I could not scream, I realized this was not the actual Grim Reaper, if there is such thing of a Grim Reaper. It was a demon that made itself into a form that knew it would scare me, like really scare me. And then my mom came rushing into the room, and what I hadn't realized is that I had been screaming the whole entire time. My mom knew exactly what was going on because this had happened before. The first few years of my life, I was tormented by demons, and she thought she had gotten rid of it. However, it was very evident that I guess one of them came back. After that one early morning, my life was changed. I could feel things that no one else would feel. I would hear and see things that no one else could hear or see. I would sense a switch in the air whenever something negative came in. My life was never the same.
This is why you should always change your locks. In 2017, a college girl woke up from a nightmare drenched in sweat and decided to rinse off before going back to sleep. She propped her phone on a shelf, turned on some music, and then hopped in the shower. A few minutes later, she reaches for her phone to change the song, but stops suddenly. Reflected on her phone's screen was a person standing in the middle of her bathroom facing the shower. She somehow kept her composure, turned the water to scalding hot, and then ripped open the curtain and sprayed the intruder in the face. As they howled in pain, she ran past them to her kitchen to get her butcher's knife. In a panic, she can't find her knife, so she just runs out of the apartment and calls the police. The police go in and come out with a crazy-looking woman in handcuffs. One of the officers comes over to the girl and says she used to live here and she had copies of your keys. Then he pauses and looks down and brings up a clear evidence bag that contained her butcher's knife, and he says, looks like she wanted her apartment back. It's what she finds in the kitchen that's really scary. In the early 90s, a young girl was sleeping in her mom's bed when she suddenly woke up for no reason. She looked at her door and she saw her very affectionate cat kind of meowing down the hall as if someone was coming up to pet it, but she was next to her mom and they were the only ones in the house. The girl shakes her mom awake and points to the cat just as a man is walking past the door and disappears into the room across the hall. Before the man could come back out and find them, they both jump out the window, run across the street, and call the police. When the police arrive, the guy is nowhere to be found, but they do discover that the front door was unlocked, so that had to be the way he got in and out. But the mother swears up and down that she locked that door before she went to bed. A week later, the mother's cleaning their kitchen and she opens up the water heater closet where she finds this notebook that inside is their names and pictures of them in it, along with a pair of surgical gloves. Which means someone had snuck in at some point, was living in that closet spying on them, and then walking around their house at night. This is why you should never explore abandoned ships. In 2014, the US Navy decided to decommission one of its oldest ships, so it brought it into port to be broken down for scrap. Before workers were allowed to actually start breaking it down, the foreman had to go on board and take pictures of every room. So late one night, the foreman spends about an hour walking through this abandoned ship with a flashlight, taking about 100 pictures. When he was done, he emailed the pictures to his boss, who quickly wrote back, "Who's the guy with the axe?" The foreman had no idea what he was talking about, but he noticed the boss had attached one of the pictures that he had just sent him. When he opened it, he nearly fainted. There, in the bowels of the ship, poking his head around a corner, was a faceless man wielding an axe. The foreman had spent over an hour in this hallway and never heard or saw this guy. The Navy searched the ship and never found this guy. They also reviewed security footage of the only entrance, and he never entered or left the ship. There is no way you can predict the ending to this one. In 1900, a man arrived on a little island off the coast of Scotland to relieve one of the 3 lighthouse workers that was there. As he neared the lighthouse, he saw the iron railings had been folded and ripped out of the concrete, and a big boulder that sat out front had moved. When he reached the lighthouse, the door was open, and inside there were half-eaten bowls of food sitting on the table, chairs flipped over, no sign of the 3 men, but there was one clue: their logbook. In the last few entries of the logbook, one of the men describes the winds outside as being more severe than anything he's seen in 20 years. He also says they've been crying and praying for the storm to stop. But why would 3 highly experienced lighthouse workers that have probably ridden out dozens of bad storms before, and they were in a brand new lighthouse that was considered safe, be crying and praying for this particular storm to end? The very last thing they wrote before they disappeared without a trace was, "Storm ended, sea is calm, God is over all." Except here's the problem: there was never any storm anywhere near their island that week.